Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Using Form-Based Codes to Create Vibrant Walkable Communities, hosted by the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network and is partially funded by the US EPA, Office of Sustainable Communities, and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars like today's Using Form-Based Codes to Create Vibrant Walkable Communities, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, which is your one-stop on the web for the most current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. We provide timely news and information about the events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Clearinghouse on smart growth topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We will be recording this webinar and will post it on our website. We encourage you to visit our website and subscribe to our weekly e-newsletter to get the latest nationwide information about smart growth and to learn about upcoming webinars. You can also find out about other planning initiatives and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To log your CM credits for this webinar, log into your account on the American Planning Association's website and search the name of today's event, Using Form-Based Codes to Create Vibrant Walkable Communities, or event number 912-8057. This webinar has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. So today we are excited to present form-based codes to create vibrant, walkable communities. Today's webinar will look at how communities are using form-based codes to create vibrant, walkable places. Chris Zimmerman of the Form-Based Code Institute and Smart Growth America will draw upon his experience in Arlington, Virginia to explain how Arlington County used form-based codes as part of an effort to transform Columbia Pike from an auto-oriented corridor into a lively main street lined with restaurants, retail, and attractive public spaces. Participants will learn about the principles of form-based codes, how these codes differ from conventional zoning codes, and how this tool can be used to encourage the development of walkable communities. Our expert today is Chris Zimmerman. Chris is Smart Growth America's Vice President for Economic Development, Director of the Governor's Institute on Community Design, and a member of the Board of Directors of the Form-Based Codes Institute. Prior to joining Smart Growth America, Chris was heavily involved in planning, development, and transportation policy in Arlington County, Virginia, and the greater Washington, D.C. region. This includes his work as a neighborhood and civic leader, as a planning commissioner, 18 years as a member of the Arlington County Board, and 13 years on the board of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, as well as other regional transportation agencies. Prior to his service as an elected official, Mr. Zimmerman was a chief economist at the National Conference of State Legislatures. Following the presentations, Chris will answer as many questions as time permits. You can ask a question anytime during the presentation by using the questions tool on the control panel located on the right side of your screen. Now I'll turn it over to Chris to get us started. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Michael. I wanted to use the experience that I've had kind of firsthand as somebody trying to figure out how to do this in a particular place, which is in Arlington, Virginia, as was said, as kind of a way to walk through why somebody might be interested in a form-based code. In my work in Smart Growth America, we assist local governments and communities around the country in trying to do particularly place-based economic development to try to find ways to revitalize communities in some case or manage growth in ways that create better environments for them. And many times what we find is that the rules that we have in place, that we've put in place over decades in government, aren't necessarily aligned with the goals we have for the kind of communities we want to create. And that was certainly my experience when I was in local government in Arlington, Virginia. And that's kind of how I came on to form-based codes and found it a useful tool in a particular application especially, and why I think that it's something we find that is of help to many communities. So this is intended to be kind of an introduction to what this is. If you probably know something about it, but if you're not real familiar with it, then we'll give you kind of the overall view of the kit of parts that makes up a form-based code. And for others who may be familiar with that, the mechanics of it, it'll show at least one place in which it's been applied and maybe give a little insight into why it matters to people who aren't necessarily professional planners but are very much involved in local policy making, whether as policymakers themselves or as advocates for the kind of community they want. So it'll be partly about what this thing is and how it works, and partly a look at the application in a particular circumstance. Let me say also that for those who are interested in finding out more about form-based codes and how to use them, the Form-Based Codes Institute will be conducting its first broad policy forum this coming October in Washington, D.C. Actually, it'll be at a location in Arlington, in the Washington, D.C. area. But if you're interested, take a look at the website at fbciforum.org, and you can find out more and register if you're interested. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why someone might look at a form-based code, and specifically why I did, what it is, and how it works, and throughout this talking about the example of the Columbia Pike corridor in Arlington where we have used it. For those who may not be familiar with the general geography, this in movies I think is called the establishing shot. Just to give you an idea where we are, if you roughly know where Washington, D.C. is, we're on the other side of the river. That's the community that I live in now and served in local government as an elected official for about 18 years. If you're a little more familiar with our area, you may know Arlington principally because of our metro rail corridors. Arlington is often cited as an example of transit-oriented development and of the kind of conversion of the suburbs with transit, largely because of these two metro rail corridors that you can see, the Roslyn-Ballston corridor in the north side being the one that is perhaps most well known, and it's an area of intense development. It's a great anchor, that and the other corridor with the blue and yellow lines in the south. Those places have 90% of our commercial activity, our office space and so on, and generate a disproportionate amount, about half our tax base, in fact. So we've had a lot of success there, and we had the ways we went about that. But we also had this significant corridor in the south that you see shown in gray there, the Columbia Pike corridor. This is a commercial street running east-west that did not have the metro line. Actually was originally to have had it, but it didn't have the same kind of success throughout the 80s and 90s that was already being experienced on the metro corridors, and that's kind of what occasioned the community's interest, my interest as an elected official, and as a resident of that corridor as well. So what this was about was we had a place that looks, well, it looked like a lot of, I'm sure, streets you have everywhere in communities all around America, basically car-oriented. There was a lot of things. I mean, there's a lot of commercial buildings of various kinds. It wasn't the most walkable environment. It had a lot of stuff that you could get. You could shop for some things there, but you basically have to go in and out of a car. And the neighborhoods around it, as wonderful residential neighborhoods all around it, one of which, as I said, I reside in. But this isn't what people who lived there really wanted to have. They wanted something that was more of a regular main street, a walkable environment. And more and more, of course, now all around the country, that walkability is a major determinant of the desirability of a place to live and the values that real estate is showing. And this is what the people in Columbia Pike were looking for, even a couple of decades ago. So, what do you do from the standpoint of local government? Well, walkability is about a lot of things, including the infrastructure for the pedestrians. We often talk about pedestrian safety and just having good places to walk and wide sidewalks and that kind of thing. The trouble is government does that because it's in the right of way. But if all you do is build pedestrian infrastructure, and you do it all right, and you have street lights and all that kind of thing, if you don't have the buildings that line it, which are basically in the private space, creating that great public realm, you don't really have a walkable place. You can walk on a sidewalk with no buildings, but who would really want to? So the question is, how can you get not just the public infrastructure right, but the kind of private development that generates this walkable place that you want to be in? And so that for that you have to turn to, well, how do we make development happen? How do we regulate what gets built? And so and this will be a little simplified, but basically we have a couple of ways we go about it in most places, and in my county in particular, there were essentially two things. There's the zoning code in the development that we call by right. Some places would say as of right. It means that the zoning regulations that were adopted, typically in the 1940s, but sometime between the 1920s and 1960s, most likely in most communities in America, that tells you where you can build buildings on a lot and how much parking you have to have and things like that. But it mostly doesn't create the kind of development that I showed on that nice walkable street. In fact, conventional zoning, for all kinds of reasons that I'm sure many people on this program are aware of, really was designed not to create that kind of street. It tends to be what reflects what the era in which it was created, which is that it's oriented toward automobiles. So it accommodates parking and makes sure you have lots of it. And the streets are intended to accommodate cars, basically. So you don't necessarily get what you want. The kind of street that I showed that we're looking for typically comes by some kind of special exception process. In other words, you have to put aside the conventional zoning, the default regulation, basically, and negotiate something. And in Arlington, most of the great walkable places that we created, particularly in those early decades, after Metro Rail opened, were done through a special exception process in which you're negotiating project by project, and you're getting the kind of development you want by relaxing the requirements that the zoning would otherwise have, such as excessive parking, but making sure you don't have parking on the surface, but you have it not abutting the sidewalk and so on. And you can get that, you can get other benefits, but you get it largely because it's in a developer's interest to go through that process because they're anticipating a lot of benefit, which in this case mostly means density that is very valuable. So they can get bigger buildings in a place that is made very valuable because in our case Metro Rail is there. That's okay for for areas like that have a lot of excess value to generate. It's not so easy when you're trying to get smaller projects where a developer may, say, there's not enough money to be made in this for me to go through that. And so even if you do get them, there's a limit to what benefits you're going to get out of it. So what else can you do is part of the question. So in an area that doesn't have a great deal of value, of sort of excess value, where you can use density as this great incentive, you may find you don't have a lot of action, and that's what we found on our corridor. This 3-mile corridor that didn't change very much over a long period of time. We had relatively little interest in investing in new things, and when we did, it wasn't what we wanted. It was single-story buildings with single purpose surrounded by parking and drive-throughs, because that's what was easy to build and which somebody could make money on. Now, we didn't have empty storefronts, but we weren't getting the kind of buildings that would accommodate new businesses either. And there really wasn't much interest in going through what we call the site plan process, which is the special exception process, for the reasons I said. So again, what else can you do? So the idea is, with form-based code, is that you make the process easier both on the community and the developer, because to some degree you're specifying ahead of time what you want, and then you're adjusting the rules so that someone who wants to build that has an easy time of it, as opposed to someone who wants to build what you want having to go through a very complicated process. Again, this special exception process had these disadvantages of requiring basically a lot of benefit to a developer to be worth going through. So, how do you make this process simpler? But what this means is that the form-based code is partly, for us anyway, and I think in general, is partly an answer to a question: how can you promote good urban design? How can you create the kind of walkable environment you're trying to get when it's really not viable to do that on a site-by-site negotiation basis? That means that it's potentially very valuable for areas that aren't necessarily going to be super dense. Now, I'm not saying you can't do it for a big dense downtown, but in places where high densities and really super high values aren't possible, that makes this, I think, a particularly potentially valuable tool. So you can perhaps get the kind of built environment you're trying to get without that much investment in the process itself for each project. So it lowers the risk for the developer because they go in knowing if they check the boxes right, they will have an approval and they can have a project that's viable. It also lowers the risk for the community because they know what they're getting under the code. And so, these are some of the advantages. It's also arguably easier to understand. You don't necessarily have to be a zoning lawyer in order to understand what the code is saying. But hopefully you'll see more of that a little further on. Now, so the example I'm going to use is this Columbia Pike code. And I should say that, form-based codes have been, kind of around a while, but only in recent years have they really taken off. So the Columbia Pike code is of interest in some ways because it is one of the relatively earlier codes, especially in a place that was not a greenfield location. Some of the early codes that have the people know about, they're kind of famous, places like Seaside and Kentlands, for instance. They were essentially single projects. Columbia Pike was a corridor that had tremendously diverse property ownership. And existing buildings over different periods of time. So it was a more real-world challenge in a way than some of those others. And well, quite a few have been done since then. It was one of the earlier attempts to do that. It also means it's not maybe as slick as some of the more recent ones, but I think it illustrates most of the basic concepts. So here's the situation for us. We had this 3-mile corridor. We wanted to transform it from a car-oriented place to a walkable main street, and we didn't have the big incentive of a major public transportation investment, and we wanted to have this happen in a reasonable period of time. I should also say that requires a lot of development, and I should note that in our community, part of the political culture and traditions was we didn't do a lot of incentive for development. We were kind of used to development paying for things we wanted in the community. So whereas many places have extensive incentives to bring development in, we had none of that. So it was particularly important for us to find a way to make it, well, to lower the barriers, frankly, for people to build the kind of things we want. We also were working within the context of Virginia government, which means a couple of things. One is strong attachment to property rights. Another is that there are limited powers of local government. What we didn't want to do was basically stir up all those property owners to oppose anything we would try to do. So in order to implement the form-based code, we did this through basically an overlay district, and we did it as an optional zoning category. Now, in your own communities, you'll have different ways of approaching this, and many places have chosen to essentially substitute a form-based code entirely for the existing zoning. And many of my friends on the, in the form-based code institute world would say that's the way you should do it. Get rid of this old system that doesn't work very well and replace it. And that if that works for you, that's great. But sometimes you have limited ability to do things politically and legally, and this was a way for us to get it done where we could say we're not taking anything away from anybody. That by right zoning you had before, that you've had for decades and decades, you still have it. You can still build the same thing you could build yesterday, you can build tomorrow. But we're giving you another option, and it's up to you whether you want to do it or not. Now, obviously, we're trying to make that option as attractive as possible so that people will build under it. But this is essentially non-compulsory, given our circumstance. I said it was an overlay district. I'll kind of come back to this, but here's that corridor, and you can see the street running kind of east-west along the spine here. But if you see the heavy black lines, those individual areas are the districts that we initially coded, that we initially applied the form-based code to. They were commercial areas, and so we started out by essentially leaving the residential areas alone and came back to them later. So this was the first part of it. Just to give you a rough idea of the timeline, because we did spend a lot of years at this. We went through decades of not much development activity, as I said, and then we began an initiative in 1998 when I was chairman of the county board for the first time to look at Columbia Pike and say, what could we do, which after several years resulted in a revitalization plan. But then how do you make it happen? And that's where we kind of found ourselves, looking into form-based code. And at that point, we actually moved somewhat quickly and got a form-based code approved. But we continued to work on other things, including the street spaces and public spaces, the transit, and eventually came back towards the end of the decade, as you can see on the right there, the early part of this decade, but about a decade after we'd approved the first one, with the rest of the code that covers the residential portions and addresses affordable housing issues, which is another story, but a major issue for us. And the ultimate form-based code actually has the provisions that are intended to protect affordable housing and generate new affordable housing. So let me talk a little bit about what a form-based code is all about, and there are different ways to describe this. But I would say there are three things that to bear in mind. One is that it'll address the question of public space, which has a lot to do with street space and what you do with your standards for streets from building face to building face, as well as the provision of public spaces like parks and plazas and things like that. Much of the action, though, because most of the land is private, this is to a large degree about what happens in private space. So it is about the regulation of private buildings and new construction, which it'll do through two principal mechanisms. The regulating plan, which basically classifies the streets, and that governs what happens on adjacent parcels, and the standards for building form that are included that tell any individual property owner, here's the way you need to build to conform to the code. So basically, this is the stuff that determines where a building goes on a lot, that deals with having walls along the street that aren't blank, that governs where parking can go. It's always important to say that this is not about architectural style. This is not design guidelines in that sense. You can have that, and there are places that are going to be historic districts where there might be historic guidelines that go along. But they're not what the form-based code is about. The form-based code is really about building form, and you can meet a form-based code's requirements typically in almost any kind of architectural style that somebody would want. The third thing that I wanted to make sure to emphasize is the public process is a big part of this as well. Form-based codes are intended to be generated in a sense by the community. There's heavy community engagement involved. This is part of what sometimes I think discourages people. But that's part of what ensures that first it comes out right, because the public has an awful lot of knowledge about their community that's relevant, but also that ensures that it has staying power, that the community feels vested in it. And that means that you use mechanisms like public design charrette that engage people directly in the process of developing the plan. Now, to look a little more closely at the plan, again, this will be reflecting kind of what we did in Columbia Pike. As I mentioned, there's the regulating plan, which I'll talk about in just a moment in a little more detail, and then the building envelope standards, which have to do with the building form and is a large part of the textual substance of the code. There are also things like architectural and streetscape standards, and some of those are optional. So, again, as I said, you can have what some people call a dress code, but you don't necessarily have to have that. But there are some architectural things people will care about. You can capture those. And standards for streetscape affect both private property and public property. So the regulating plan is essentially a map. It's a map that identifies streets and classifies them, and identifies where public spaces are, such as parks and plazas, things like that, the way you want to have them. And it's it's kind of the foundation for the whole thing. The streets are coded in a way that tells you what the adjacent property, what rules govern the adjacent property, in a way I'll show in just a moment. So in the case of Columbia Pike, there's a regulating plan and a statement about it that you see on the screen now, which basically identifies what the overall purpose is. I should say too, all this can be seen on the Arlington County website, where the whole code is available. So the regulating plan codes building sites based on their street frontage. Are you a major street, like a main street? Are you a side street, a neighborhood street? There's a classification system, and these other kinds of elements are determined by that. It's also where you see where parking can go and where it can't go, as well as the location of public spaces. It identifies the places where streetscape improvements will need to be made, such as the tree lawn, or utility space, or it's called different things in different parts of the country, I found, but the space between the sidewalk and the curb, where trees go, where street furniture goes, and so on. And other things like retail requirements or not. And if you happen to have historic preservation, that can go in there too. So here's an example from, again, this Columbia Pike regulating plan. And you can see that there's a diagram. It shows, the color tells you what kind of a street you're on. Red in this case is Main Street footage. There are several different categories: Main Street, Avenue, Local, Neighborhood. And those, each of them have a corresponding set of rules for buildings that we'll talk about in a moment. And as you can see, it also shows where civic buildings go, where parks and public spaces go. This is kind of pulling back and looking at the diagram for one of the largest area in our case that is governed by the code. And you can see, again, the red is the Main Street, which is a lot of it. And you can see other things designated as well. This is a smaller one at a different end of the pike, but that's basically what the regulating plan does. So once you know how your street is coded, then you can go and look at the building envelope standards and say, okay, what can I build? So you go to the building envelope standards, and these are the things that basically control the form of buildings that are constructed. As you can see, and this on the right is a page from the code, and you can see that it's diagrammatic. So it has some advantages over traditional zoning, and just the fact that most people can look at it and understand what's going on in a way that might be difficult. For each of these, there are several things. There are height specifications, siding specifications, different elements, and some use regulation, because form-based code doesn't entirely ignore use necessarily. But I'm going to go through each of these. So here's an example. If you had a red code on that regulating plan, then that's a Main Street frontage. And you go to the building envelope standard for Main Street, and you see that this box here shows you how tall you can build, and it's generally specified in stories. You can have feet requirements too, but stories is helpful in a number of ways. One of which is making it easy for people to understand. It's also helpful in getting some variety, so everything doesn't necessarily have to fit an exact line, which may not be desirable. But in any case, it states for a given street how big you can be. In this case, on a main street, what it means is buildings can be from 3 to 6 stories. In this case, we don't want buildings taller than 6 stories, and we don't want buildings smaller than 3 stories on that kind of street frontage. Now, if you looked at the same thing for an avenue or for a neighborhood, you'd see different requirements. Siting standards show where the building can go, and in this case, rather than setbacks as conventional zoning has, this has a required building line. So you have to build to that line, in this case abutting presumably the sidewalk, and it has some other requirements, including setbacks for alley space where that's needed, and any provision for open space in the lot itself that might be necessary. But the main point of this is to tell you where to put the building. Another major feature concerns the building frontage. What are we going to be walking past? And we don't want blank walls. Well, this is the part of the code that ensures we don't get blank walls. For a Main Street building, for instance, here, it tells you that you have to have fenestration at the street level of between 60% and 90%, and above street level in the upper stories between 30% and 70%. And then, of course, I mentioned uses, and in some places uses may be wide open, but we do have places where we want to hold a ground floor, in particular to retail, let's say, or retail or office. And so it's typical in our case, Main Street, basically the ground floor is what's governed. The upper floors actually could be residential or office for the most part, at the discretion of whoever's building. So that's, this is the building envelope standard, and let me let you see kind of where it's applied and how it looks with actual projects. So here's again that Main Street building envelope standard with its height specification. There's a relatively new building just constructed in this picture anyway, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and it's a 6-story building as the as the code calls for. Again, where the buildings go and what you can do and what you can't do. If you look at the top, that's an example of a building built according to the code up to the sidewalk where we want it. Below is obviously something from the previous age, where what you have next to the sidewalk is a big parking lot and you have strip shopping behind it. So the lower picture is something you can't build under this code. You almost have to build it under the old zoning code. And again, to look at this a little more closely, there's a build-do line, and the code is telling you where that is, and that's what you have to do, is go to the required building line. So this is one of the most important features of the code that separates it from the current zoning that most places have. Under the old zoning, you could do this, and in fact, you might find yourself almost having to do this. This is another building that exists on Columbia Pike that was built under the traditional zoning requirements, and what you can see is we have a sidewalk, pretty good sidewalk, and then we have a parking lot, and the parking lot is between the sidewalk and the building. And even if you wanted to go around the corner to get to the building, you can see you have a big wide curb cut there, access to the parking lot, of course, that's between you and the storefronts. So this isn't the worst case you can show, but it's an example of the kind of thing that really isn't pedestrian oriented and is not really in a full sense an urban building. It was perfectly legal, almost necessary under existing zoning, but under the form-based code you can't do this because the the siting requirements would not allow you to put the building there. So elements, again, window specifications, that fenestration requirement I talked about, so we don't get blank walls. Again, on the left side, you can see 2 examples of buildings constructed under the code that have this. On the right, a particularly nasty example of the kind of thing that exists in places where you don't have these requirements. And to go back to, this is the building I was showing before that that is set back behind a parking lot, and just to pick on it again, if you look along the ground floor, you can see we have on one side we have a completely blank wall. You couldn't see that in the other picture, so that wouldn't be allowed because the code now says ground story facade shall have between 60 and 90% fenestration. Obviously, it doesn't have that. And in the front facing the main street, you can see on the upper story a big section of blank wall, and you have to have between 30 and 70% fenestration. So, these are examples of how the new code would prevent a building from being built just in this manner. Although I should point out that a new building could be taller than this one, since this is a 4-story building and the new code allows 6 stories. So I'll give you some other examples of how the code impacts what happens on the streetscape. These are 2 examples of townhouse projects that are actually almost right next to each other along the main road. One built a few decades earlier, before the code, and according to by right zoning. That's the one on the left, in case you hadn't guessed, where we have sidewalk, and then we have essentially fence in the back sides of places. There's essentially a buffer condition. People in their homes don't really want to relate to the street here, and the street is kind of left by itself. It's not in that sense an urban street. On the right, we have townhouses built more recently, and I will say more valuable units, built according to the new code that requires the building to address the street. And as you can see, this is a very traditional street, really, and you can walk down the street and expect to see people coming in and out of their houses. You have windows that at the very least may be lit. You probably will feel safer walking down this stretch of the street than the other one, especially if it's getting dark. Again, similar thing. These same conditions with a couple of townhouse projects. On the left, something that was built by right zoning, I'd say in the 80s, where again the goal is mostly to buffer. So we get at this nice wall. Somebody spent money on it, but all it's really doing is dividing the public space from the private space. Whereas on the right, we have a street that addresses the buildings that address the street, and a much more human environment. Again, we do look at uses. So here's a commercial building, and it does provide for retail on the ground floor, for a mezzanine that could have some office or secondary retail, and then residential or office above it. This happens to be a residential building. That's what the market wanted, but it could have been office as well. Also on the side street, we have secondary retail. So as I said, there are other kinds of things that are governed, like street trees and other plantings that will be constructed in association with these buildings. Our code says what kind of trees you can plant and what kind of street furniture needs to be there. Materials and standards, there are things we allow and things we don't allow. Those aren't necessarily fundamental form-based code, but most communities want to regulate those to some degree or another, and the form-based code system is flexible, basically. We have things, for instance, like lead requirements, and those are incorporated into the code just as they would to anything else, and you can include them or not include them, basically, and other kind of specific things that may be of importance. I do want to say something about the public realm, because again, this is very much about regulating private development, because that is the majority of the land, but the public part of this is really important as well, and we do have street space standards that correspond to the different types of street we want to have, depending on what class of street we're talking about, and that governs things like where vehicles go, where transit vehicles go, bicycles, the sidewalk space, of course, street trees, depending on, again, the classification of the particular street. As I said, the process is also a big part of what's involved with form-based code. We did this through very heavy public engagement, which is part of the political culture of my community, but I think that this is really inherent to the goals of form-based code. The idea is this should be something that most people would be able to say, if this were built, I can live with that. I would like this. It would be better for me than not having something built. And you get that by involving the community early on and in a pretty fundamental way. So we held a very large charrette. We had private firms, in our case Dover Coal out of Florida, that was the overall in charge of this. The code writing was Farrell Madden out of Washington, D.C., and our own staff working, and lots of community members. And so for about a week, we had pretty heavy engagement, which started with big assemble, you all come, and people getting presentations on the first night, and beginning to be engaged in discussions about what this would be and what they wanted and their hopes for the community. We had on the weekend big work sessions where community members sat around tables and got to hold crayons and maps and draw on them and come up with their own concepts and work on them with each other, which is partly a way of capturing the knowledge in the community about their own community, because it's fine to have experts, but in a way all the people who live there are the real experts in a very tangible way. They know this community and know those streets, and bringing them together with people who have technical knowledge can be really a very creative process. And then they get to present to each other and kind of show the concepts they have. And then the experts, the design team, gets to take all this back and try to generate something that reflects what the community is after, which is done in a very public way. There was a storefront space, which is what you see here, occupied, and the team worked, but it worked in a way that anybody who could, wanted to, could walk in and see what they were doing, ask questions, and see how things were coming together. And have input in that way as well. And then of course we got people back together and showed them the result and said essentially, is this what you had in mind? Is this what you meant? And then you can do further adjustments. In the end, it produced an actual code that reflects those values of the community, and pretty good consensus of what people wanted to see, that was approved. The charrette was in the fall of 2002. The code was approved in February of 2003. And within a few months we had a couple of building projects approved. So this was the 2003 code. As I said before, it's an optional zoning category. It's very prescriptive, but you don't have to do it. You could do the by right zoning, but most developers, I think, will find, most property owners will find they have a lot more options under the form-based code than under their, their pre-existing by right zoning. The approval process is meant to be, relatively simple. There aren't a lot of exceptions. There aren't a lot of modifications possible. There are actually two forms of process under this, one of which is for the smaller sites, which is meant to be a purely administrative review. For the larger sites, where there's a little more concern in the community that people actually build what they're supposed to, there is a requirement for a use permit review, which basically in our system means the Planning Commission has a hearing, the county board has to approve it, but it's not a negotiation process. It's essentially a hearing process that is just to ensure that the code is actually being met. And again, this is the initial map that in those areas that are highlighted in bold black are the areas in which the code applied from 2003. We then later did a second phase, as I mentioned, in which we looked at the housing issues in particular and at the areas that had traditionally under the traditional zoning been residential. And we started studying that in 2008, and by 2012 had a new code, a new plan approved and code adopted that is known as the Columbia Pike Neighborhoods Area Plan. It essentially focuses on all those residential areas around the commercial nodes that were the subject of the original form-based code. So there's more coding there, but there's also housing goals and tools for affordable housing built into it. This may be a little hard to see, but there are some fine red lines you can see right along the pike in the center of these that are where the original code applied. The area with the kind of purple lines are the larger area, which were mostly multifamily housing, where the new code applies. Outside of that, there are single family areas where we did not change any rules. So the single family areas are essentially still governed by the existing zoning. Those are built out areas, and again, if I were doing from scratch, I wouldn't necessarily have done it that way, but the reality is we have these communities, people live in them, and they're not what people wanted changed. So we have a substantially larger area now potentially under form-based code. Again, we did the same process. We had a big charrette again, and brought people together again in order to come up with that code. So how's it working? Let me give you just a kind of a quick look at some of the things that we had. We got some projects right away that the code applies to. So here's one of the places on the pike where we had traditional frontage. These buildings were mostly built in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And people, wanted to keep that. They didn't want to lose that. One of these buildings was a traditional hardware store. The hardware store is long gone, but people still felt, obviously had a lot of sentiment around the building and the block. So the code allows something, but you had to preserve that frontage. And here's the project as it was completed. This was actually the very first project we got under the code, and you can see the historic frontage and the parts of that. They are actually part of the new building that extends in the back. Let me go back for a moment. If you look to the left, you can't see it in this picture very well, but there's a parking, essentially the back was a parking lot, and at the very far left was a power substation, all of which went away as a result of this project, which is residential with retail on the ground floor. We also got a level of public parking as part of it to help support other development, so that every site doesn't have to solve its own parking problems. This is the backside of that building where the power substation used to be. We have a new street that didn't exist, and secondary retail along that street, again, in a place that was essentially, not the place you'd want to walk before. Here is what had been kind of an abandoned grocery store. As you can see, the wall's blank. It used to have a lot of graffiti on it. I think this is right before we did the charrette. Somebody painted so they didn't have the graffiti. But as you can see, although it was built to the sidewalk, it wasn't really a very friendly building at all. It isn't a place you'd want to walk. In fact, this picture was done as part of the charrette. These folks you see here, these are actually digitally photoshopped in. A guy named Steve Price, who's one of the best in the country at this stuff, was part of the project team, and he gave us those pedestrians. There weren't actually any pedestrians in the picture at the time. Now, the Form-based code allowed a lot more building, and somebody was willing to do that. This was one of the earlier projects, and as you can see, we have 5 stories of residential over retail, and we have actual storefront now, a place you might want to walk, and we also actually get pedestrians now there, so that's nice. Another end of the pike, we had one of these, essentially strips at the back of a parking lot, typical of the building from the time, and that allowed for something more substantial. And now we have a 10-story residential building. That this is right after it was constructed. It's now been there a while, and the ground floor has occupants on the retail side as well. We also got committed affordable housing as part of some of the projects that have been done. There are a few of these now. This one happens to have been done on actually public land. To the right of the image is a community center that the county put up and then provided the land behind on a ground lease basically for free to a nonprofit to build committed affordable housing, but they had to comply with the code. So this is a code compliant building. And then we had this big centerpiece area where there was an old shopping center, and it was like all the, like grocery stores were, parking lot between the street and the building. You can kind of get a sense of what that was like. And here's the site right before demolition in 2009, and here's the same site in 2011, right when it opened. New grocery store, which is actually on the 2nd story on the right. Ground floor retail below that, and above that residential, and a new plaza on the left, which I'll show you more of in a moment. This is something I wanted to point out. On the back side of this, the building, this is what the building looked like if you were on the back of the old grocery store and shopping center, and you had there are single family houses facing this. What you saw was the back side. And you can see that office building in the distance as off on the left as a reference point. So when the project was done, here's what that looks like. You can see the office building on the left. And you can see this is a much more friendly street for the single family houses that face it now. And it does other things as well, because it turns out it actually also buffers a lot of sound. So it's quieter in here than it was before, even though we added all that density. But it creates a much better transition. And although you can't quite see it here, there's actually a pass through towards the left where that last street lamp is. So you can walk right through from the neighborhood into where the grocery store is, and down some steps to the plaza if you want to, what's Penrose Square as it's called now. This is the site that was the parking lot. That parking lot you saw in the first image, which was all asphalt, is now a park with a fountain you can see in the back, in which kids play all summer long. So we still have a lot of undeveloped sites, but we have a lot more going on than we had before we started this, and the new development seems to be providing the kind of environment that we were looking for and creating the kind of place we wanted. So for the most part, I think we've had a pretty good experience with it. And with that, I'm going to stop, say thank you for listening, and answer any questions you may have. Michael?
Thanks, Chris. Thank you very much. Yes, we're here. And I appreciate pulling this information together for us. We have gotten several questions already. And those of you who have more can still submit them. Just as a summary, we're now going to move into our question and answer session. We've been assembling the questions posed by our audience, and now we will ask Chris about them. You may continue to submit questions, and we'll answer as many as we have time for. And we've just got another whole batch in here. So, Chris, just to start, appreciate the kind of the complexity of this corridor, and also the amount of time that the planning process took from, you talked about late 90s starting to just a couple of years ago kind of revisiting the neighborhood scale. How much of that process is kind of baked into doing form-based code wherever we might do it, and how much was kind of specific to this corridor?
Well, we clearly spent a lot of years working on this. So, as I said, we had an initiative from 1998, and we basically spent 4 years talking to people and making plans and coming up with concepts before we looked at all at, really how to implement it, how to make it happen. I mean, that's part of what happened was if you get people to agree on, that they'd like something to happen, well, now what do you do? So I don't think you necessarily have to spend 15 years, working on something like this. When we actually said, okay, the way to do this is actually this form-based code thing, let's try that, and we brought in a team to do that, we were less than 12 months from really beginning that process to having a code in place and approving projects. So I think, a certain amount of it is necessary and inherent. It does take time to, to develop a consensus around what this thing's going to be. It saves you more time at the other end because you're not negotiating projects on a case-by-case basis. But some of it is part of it. I mean, it definitely takes more investment from the beginning than just saying, well, we have this land out here, and let's see what anybody wants to propose, and doing everything site by site. But it doesn't necessarily have to take a tremendous amount of time. And I would say actually that if you want to do this, you need to define a fairly narrow amount of time to do it in, because you don't keep these consensus situations for long. So you have to get people on a page together and then show them results pretty quickly. And so within a year or two, you need to be going from starting this to having something in place. That's my view.
Okay. And I appreciate the questions are flooding in here, actually. So what impact has form-based code had on historic buildings?
Well, in our case, we had buildings we wanted to keep, and we didn't necessarily have any existing protections on them. So, like the frontage I showed you in the one case, there was no historic district protecting that. The people who owned the property could have torn them down and done whatever they wanted to do. So we used the code in a way to encourage the preservation. We identified those areas and certain other ones, buildings that we wanted to maintain, and wrote the code so that you could do something with the property, but you had to preserve either the whole building or just frontage, depending on the situation that we have. And as you saw, we were able to accomplish that without actually having any kind of historic review process in those cases. I mean, if we had that in place, then you could just incorporate that, of course. But it gave us a mechanism for helping to maintain some historic buildings that otherwise I don't think we'd have had any hope of maintaining.
Okay. How is parking handled in these very dense projects? Are they structured? Is it not required? Did the plan substantially reduce parking ratios?
So there's a couple of things. One is the location of parking, which is identified, in the code. Essentially, the siting requirements show you where parking can go, and mostly it's saying there's a restraining line that runs parallel to the required building line. That is, you have to push it back. And in effect, you can push it under, you can push it above, or you can push it back, but you can't have it adjacent to the street. So where parking goes is regulated. And curb cuts for access to parking is also regulated. In terms of the amount of parking required, again, a lot of people would say just do away with it and have parking maximums, not minimums, which in many cases may be a good solution. That wasn't going to be viable for us. We had to convince neighbors that they weren't going to have they weren't going to be flooded with excess automobiles because people couldn't park. So we do have parking requirements still, but we try to relax them in certain ways. In particular, we don't want every single lot to have to solve all its parking problems, particularly smaller buildings. These sites wind up having one-story buildings with parking all around them, in part because we make the activity support a lot of parking, and every property has to do that itself. So under this code, there are ways around that, so you can do something and not necessarily have parking directly on site. You could have it off-site nearby. You can have it across the street. And with the larger project, we basically incorporated a parking strategy into this. And we identified the places we wanted to have extra parking. Essentially underground parking. But in two of the big projects I showed, the one that had the historic frontage and the one with the grocery store, the parking part of the deal included a level of parking that is available to the public, so that it's for pay, and it's just paid the same way our meters would, at the same rates basically as metered on the street parking. But what it means is that there's parking to support the other activities, and other buildings don't necessarily have to have as much parking. And so we've had a project or two that has lower parking because you can park across the street in the garage that's there. So part of the strategy is to reduce the burden of parking cost, and to make sure there actually is parking available, but it's not excessive, and it doesn't get in the way of everything.
Okay. Kind of related to the street itself, are there any plans to make Columbia Pike itself more walkable, for example, with a road diet, 2 lanes, bike lane, median strip, or something like that?
We did a lot of studying on the road over the course of this period. I mean, I kind of condensed things, but there were a lot of things we were doing, one of which was studying the behavior on the street, the vehicle volumes, finding ways to improve transit service. We made a lot of improvements to transit service, and we did a lot of planning around where bicycles would go and how that would work. A couple of things that we ran into: the street carries about 25,000–30,000 vehicles a day. We didn't find it viable to reduce it to 1 lane in each direction. It's 2 lanes in each direction. Largely because it had all those curb cuts and didn't have turn lanes, it was often very difficult getting through there because left turn vehicles would be stopping the left lane, and buses in the right lane might stop the right lane. So part of the plan accommodates this by putting in turn lanes in appropriate places, and making the street flow better. But we didn't see, although I should say we did, however, skinny up the lanes. So we lowered the requirements from the lane to, if I remember correctly, it was 11 feet and 10 feet. We're able to capture some space that way and get in parking along, because in many places there was no curbside parking, and that's part of contributing to the more buffered feel for pedestrians on the sidewalk, as well as helping to deal with the parking issues. So we did work on that pretty extensively, and there's been a pretty heavy program that's continued in the years since I left the board, and is going on right now, to improve the streetscape, putting in that new sidewalk and much more elaborate streetscape with more space for pedestrians and trees and streetlights and things like that, that continues to move on down the pike. Okay.
Kind of in a related way, how has the increased density impacted traffic loads on the corridor?
So far, as I know, it hasn't changed terribly much at all, but that's been Arlington's experience overall. We've had tremendous increases in density in our metro corridor, and many of those intersections have traffic loads comparable to what they had in the 1970s, before we added millions of square feet. This is for a few reasons, one of which is the road functions a little better now. We've had a tremendous increase in public transportation usage. So this was Columbia Pike was always a big bus corridor, and within Virginia it had the highest ridership of any bus line in the state before we started, and we've increased that by at least 50% or 60% in the corridor now, with a lot more bus service and improved services in a number of different ways. And also because, for the most part, people who move to residents that are located in these places, they're not going there to drive everywhere. So, to some degree, they reduce trips because now they walk downstairs to the grocery store, to the coffee shop or whatever, and again, they may take the bus to go to work. They have more options, and bicycling is a more and more viable option. Again, if you're living in this place that now has more places you can walk to, you don't need to run in and out with your car every time. So that has also helped. So I haven't seen recent data. I will say that the county monitors these things very closely. In fact, has now systems in place for the last 5 years or so where they have pretty much close to real-time information about vehicles, and so they know more than we ever used to know on an ongoing basis what's happening on the street. But well, volumes are probably up a little bit, but they're not up in any way commensurate with the increase in density on Pike.
Okay. And I'll just read this question. It appears that the dreadful power lines shown in one of the first photos are now gone. according to the photos that you showed that had the more recently built projects. Can you tell us more about public infrastructure improvements, specifically concerning utilities?
Yeah, so in general, in Arlington, we've tried to get all the utilities taken care of when streetscape's done, and in the places in the metro corridors where we have, a special exception process, what Arlington calls the site plan process, and you're negotiating site by site. That's a standard part of what Arlington has always expected developers to do. You will build the new sidewalk for us, and you will put all the utilities underground. In the case of this kind of corridor, not all the infrastructure is going to get done through development because obviously there's not the same kind of excess value. We're building 6-story buildings, not 26-story buildings. So some of that gets taken care of as part of certain developments in certain locations. A lot of it is part of the county having an infrastructure plan that runs parallel. I said there's an overall Columbia Pike initiative of which the form-based code was part. Part of that initiative was looking at the public spaces in the street and planning out what had to be done, and that includes new investment that's been making its way systematically down the pike for a good number of years now to put in new proper sidewalks, street trees and street furniture and lamps, street lamps, and part of that is getting all the utilities taken care of. In fact, that's the part that takes the most time generally, an awful lot of preparation and negotiation and coordination before they can actually even dig, and when that happens, then the utility lines go down and new ductwork is put in underground so that in the future all that stuff can be handled as I would say it should be below the level of the street.
Right. I guess, and then in regards to the trees themselves, does the form-based code require any urban street minimums or account for the long-term health of the trees?
We have street tree standards separate from the code, but again, the code can directly address this, and you can also address it in other ways. But the short answer is yes. There are standards for how the ground has to be prepared, because a large part of whether a tree is successful or not has to do with the soil that you're putting it in, and how extensive it is, and how being able to accommodate the root system for a large canopy tree. The variety of tree, there are certain trees that are permitted and certain ones that aren't permitted, and that kind of thing.
Okay. How applicable is form-based code to urban areas that don't have the same need for density in terms of residential uses?
Well, so for us, this is sort of in between density, because we're in a metropolitan area and in a county itself that has some really high densities. But this is scalable. I mean, the short answer is you can do this at any scale. You can do a form-based code for a place that's a small town. I looked at one just in this past year for a little town in Virginia that is probably got maybe a few thousand people, and most of the buildings aren't more than a story. You can scale the code to the scale of development you want. For in our case, 6 stories was a modest scale because of the context we have here, but you don't have to. You can dial it up or dial it down depending on what's appropriate for your community.
Great. So I think this is somewhat related, but in a different fashion. How important is the market implementing form-based code? Do you have to have a strong market, and can form-based code work well in a weak market?
So I think you first have to ask the question of, how is the market for any development to happen? Because if you don't have a strong enough market, then nobody's going to build, right? I mean, the development, building stuff implies the confidence that someone who's investing has that there's going to be a market for their product, and that's true whatever kind of building regulations you have. I would say that part of the claim of form-based code is whatever the level of the market is, we can expedite this because we can make it easier. We can lower the sort of excess cost for those who are putting money into developing property by simplifying the regulatory process. That doesn't mean it's less regulated necessarily, and it's pretty prescriptive, form-based code, but it means you have a high degree of certainty that if I come in with something and my architects and the people I have working on this present something that complies with the code, it will be approved, and I can move ahead, and I don't, won't get bogged down in a long process for approval, which adds a lot of cost and uncertainty. So, in a strong market, you can get more things developed while there's the opportunity. In a weak market, I would say it's more likely that a project is going to pencil for the person who wants to build it, because you've at least reduced, that degree of uncertainty and certain kinds of costs. At the same time, if you don't have a market, form-based code by itself isn't necessarily going to make it happen. There may be places, though, that are on a margin where they don't seem to have a market, and the reason they don't have a market is because nobody thinks there's enough money to be made in building there, given what they have to go through in order to get something approved. Or the kind of thing that they would like to build, simply isn't allowed. And, again, they're running into the question of, well, how would I talk them into letting me build something else? So I think it can facilitate it. But again, it doesn't solve the fundamental problem that people are only going to want to build if they think they're going to be able to get their costs recovered and make a profit in the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is a specific question, but you could generalize it if you want. Were local, state, federal grant loan incentives used for private developments and public spaces? And if so, could you name a few?
Well, where we have affordable housing, the one project I showed, I believe included federal tax credits, that are available for affordable housing projects, the low-income rental tax credit. That's certainly used extensively in our community, as in many others. Other than that, we did not have, for instance, new market tax credits or anything like that. There's not a lot in the way of, state programs in Virginia that I think we would have been eligible for. So I'm trying to think if there are some others. I mean, some of the public infrastructure, sure, there's federal and state funds available, for public infrastructure, in the streets and so on. And I'm sure that, if we look back on it, the proportion of that was the state funds that the county's eligible for, going to do that kind of street work, the transit work. Again, there's some state funds that help to support that kind of thing. But for the most part, it's largely private dollars on the private property and largely county dollars on the public side.
Okay. Can you discuss the jobs housing balance in the corridor? Are there more people living and working in the same neighborhoods now?
That's a good question. I haven't seen recent enough data to know, so I'm not sure. I don't. I can't say with certainty. My sense, just as someone who lives there, is it seems that way. I will say that most of the people who live in that corridor, like myself, probably come downtown or or work in one of the metro corridors where most of the employment is. So this is not it's not an office-heavy environment. It's mostly residential, retail, and small commercial. So there is more employment there now than there was, but it is still more more heavily residential. But when we talk about the balance in the corridor, remember that, well, remember you wouldn't necessarily know, but if you can think to the map I showed, the corridor runs east-west. At the east end is the Pentagon in Crystal City. So a lot of people can walk up to the Pike, get on a bus, and if they're one of the 30,000 people or so who work in the Pentagon, they're there just at the end of the corridor. Or if they are one of the 90,000 or so who work in the Crystal City area, they can be there pretty quickly. Or if they're like me, they take it down to the to Pentagon or Pentagon City and get on a train to go downtown. So I would say it's still more of a residential area, with the commercial mostly serving those neighborhoods. But I think there is more employment than there was, and potentially there could be more, since the code is more flexible in providing, for instance, for office uses than would have been true in the past.
Okay. Did you have any public or nonprofit developers involved in helping implement the plans beyond traditional infrastructure? For example, did you use business improvement districts or any other means for ongoing marketing and public amenities?
Well, so we didn't have a business improvement district. There is a public-private partnership called the Columbia Pike Revitalization Organization, or CPRO, which has been around for, I think it's now about 30 years. that gets some funding from the county and funding from property owners and businesses, and is governed by a board that includes representatives of property owners, businesses, the county, and the neighborhoods that surround it. And it's heavily involved in a lot of activities. Was before the code, was during the development of the code, and continues in this day. So, for instance, things like activities. We have a farmers market in one of those. I didn't show this, but there's a plaza with a farmers market on Sundays, and the CPRO is involved in that. It's not a bid, as I said. It doesn't have a lot of the functions of that. It doesn't have a large budget. It's only really been 1 to 3 staffers, I think, at any time in its history. But it did serve as the venue to bring people together. They sponsor things like the Big Blues Festival every year, which occurred this past Saturday. That's a marketing thing that lets people in a broader region know about the Pike and come there. There are other activities like that CPRO is involved in. So we did have a little bit of that public partnership, private partnership, and I do think that was very important. I think CPRO has been an important part of the success that the Pike has had over the last particularly 10, 15 years. But it's really small compared to what some business improvement districts are. It doesn't have that kind of dedicated source of funding that bids typically have with an add-on real estate tax or anything like that. They're doing a lot with very little revenue and limited powers.
Okay. Kind of a related question. How does Arlington coordinate features like street furniture along the corridor? Are they paid for and installed by individual projects, or is there some overall fund that developers pay into, or another structure?
For the most part, at least with the early projects, the larger projects had requirements for Streetscape that were part of the development. So the developer was providing that and basically building the sidewalk out to the specifications made by the county. There are stretches in which the county's doing that that are largely the places that don't have that potential for kind of in-between spaces. And the specifications were in the code. I would say, when we did it in the beginning, we may not have gotten it exactly right the first time. Some of the early projects showed like maybe more benches along the street than we needed. We were maybe a little too enthusiastic. So, you do have to adjust these things over time. But the short answer is it's a mix of requirements for private development and public investment.
Okay. Is there an issue of having too much retail or commercial uses required at the ground level that the market does not support?
Yeah, I mean, let me say that's an issue apart from form-based code questions, right? That's a general question of, we want retail in a lot of places for lots of good reasons, because we want the retail to be available and because we want to, generate the activity on the street. You hear a lot today that the U.S. is over-retailed, and that certainly on a national level we have a lot more retail space and a lot of it empty, and a lot of it being closed out for a lot of different reasons. Part of it being overbuilding in the previous decade, and part of it being the impacts of online marketing and that kind of thing. So this is an issue that we definitely have to think about. I will say that a lot of the excessive retail we have are in places that are car-oriented. And a lot of that's never coming back. I heard someone say that we're not over-retailed, we're under-demolished in the United States in retail. And I think that a lot of those places won't come back. I think the on-street retail in vibrant, walkable areas, will have a future. On the other hand, we have been in a market in the last few years that, although we've come out of the recession, not everything's come out of the recession. And so, it's a particularly difficult time. A lot of new buildings have come on that are successful but can't fill that ground floor space, particularly if they're trying to fill it with, a certain kind of tenant, such as those that, have national credit ratings and things like that. So on the one hand, I think we have to be cautious about being, too aggressive in trying to put retail all over the place. And at the same time, I also don't want to see us get kind of talked out of activating the street level, because the market at the moment is weak. But I do think there are large questions about what retail is going to be in the future. And I think we have to be creative about how we treat these, storefront spaces, the ground level, in the places we really do want to have activated. One thing is many of our codes, and many times our codes define specifically what is retail and define out certain kinds of things. Some of the activities we made previously have not said we wanted there. We might need to find ways to accommodate, and there are new possibilities. For instance, there's new light manufacturing, small-scale manufacturing popping up all over the place, and it's a new kind of activity that might not have been allowed under older codes, but might be perfectly appropriate to have in an urban area, and might help to fill the space and activate the streets. So I do think that's an area that we're all going to have to be looking at more closely and carefully and innovating in the years to come.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of kind of accounting for changing conditions, do you regularly evaluate the code or make modifications to it?
Modifications have been made. We sort of had to look back because of the fact we were doing a second phase of the code. There have been little amendments over time. When we started, we found some unintended consequences or errors, things we had to correct. I think any code needs to be reviewed. In another presentation with more time, I show you all the stuff that are, kind of the pitfalls, because we did discover a lot of them. I will tell you that we passed a code in 2003, but I think we lost a lot of opportunity because our actual implementation wound up being much more difficult to getting to where people could actually take advantage of the code, and we missed some of the better years for development before the crash happened. It happened that one of our biggest projects, the one I showed with the grocery store in the plaza, was self-financed by the landowner in the middle of the day. They started in 2009 at the depth of the recession and opened it in 2011, but you can't always count on folks to do that, and part of the reason it took a while was because of some of the things that when we initially did it, we realized we needed to fix. So I think if you're looking at this, you want to learn from that. And I'll just cite one in particular. We didn't actually have, it turned out, a really good up-to-date survey for the whole street, and it had been done in the 20s or 30s or something, and that meant that whereas our code says build to the required building line, actually fixing where that line wasn't necessarily where people thought it was, and so we had to go and have the street resurveyed to be able to tell people, okay, here's the line, here's where it is, and there were things like that we ran into that took a little more time to implement and did require some modifications.
Okay, we've gotten several questions about the process of developing it with the public, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And specifically, what was the public engagement process like? Did you receive any pushback? And looking back on the charrettes, is there anything that you would have done differently?
Well, pushback, I would say, is part of the process, and when it's successful, what you have is a not necessarily unanimity, but a whole lot of people who come into it skeptically come out supporters. And I will say that over the years that followed, one of the really kind of satisfying parts of the experience was that when there was criticism, when there were people that attacked the code that was put in place, the defense came not simply from the county, or even especially from the county. The defense tended to come from people in the community who said, we worked on this, and this is the reason we did this, and this is why we have this provision, and this is why it's a good thing. And it's a lot more effective when you have people in the community standing up and saying, this is a good plan, and we want it to to be respected. So that, I think, is the result of having a lot of participation and taking the time to do that. It's not easy. But it does have that payoff farther in, as you get more into the projects themselves. We, I think, had a really good, robust process, particularly on that first go round, when we were, starting with nothing. Later on, it's somewhat easier because people can see projects and see what you're trying to build. But in the beginning, this was, kind of blue sky, and people weren't sure if this was ever really going to happen, and they were going to see buildings like this constructed. So there's a fair amount of skepticism, which was justified. But we had a very good team that did this. I mentioned, the firm of Dover Cole is one of the best at, engaging the community and listening to them. And that, I think, is really important. You got to have folks who are good at listening and good at translating what people are saying into something they can see, and building confidence over time. You won't win over everybody, and that's all right, but you do have to build a substantial amount of trust in the community that they have a a feeling that this is going to result in something that I will recognize as what I was trying to get, and that that it's worth the time to put in on their end, because of course it actually takes time for community members in their own personal time as well to be involved.
Mm-hmm. So you have a kind of a unique perspective as well as being an elected official. So, but for those who are working with elected officials, how do you convince them that they should adopt form-based code?
So, I think it's a question of what are your goals? What are you trying to do? And if what you're trying to do is create a walkable community, a certain kind of environment, if you're looking at placemaking as a key part of an economic development strategy, that's one thing. If you're trying to, some people are mostly interested in getting development to happen, and that's the main thing. That's one of the interesting things about this as an instrument. It's pretty flexible because some people want to control development because they see it happening, but they're afraid of the form it's going to take. Some people want something to happen, they're afraid it isn't going to happen. And I think form-based code, you can talk about it with folks in a way that addresses both sides of that. For those who want development to happen, I think the main point is that your regulations may be actually getting in the way. And so this is a way of having the government's regulations not get in the way of this thing that you want to have happen. At the same time, people who are worried about negative impacts of development, and if you're an elected official, that may be you're concerned about the community being mad about negative development, then this is a way to say, we know what we want, and we don't want something built if it isn't that. And because it is prescriptive but easy to understand, people can see it as something that says, okay, if they build that way, it's all right. And although it takes this upfront investment of time and effort, afterwards you're pretty good idea of what it is you're going to get, and that that can relieve you of some of that. I think that's the main question is, what is it you're trying to do, and how are your existing rules getting? Are you getting what you want? I mean, that's most places I talk to folks about it. Are your rules that you have in place, the processes you have, the systems you have, is it getting you what you want? And lots of places can't say yes to that. So they, if they really want to do something, they need to look at alternatives. And this is one that is now being proven to work in that way in a lot of different places.
Okay. So we've gotten many questions, and we won't be able to get to them all. But I guess we'll just to kind of wrap up, and I'll ask one quick question to you. Are there downsides to form-based code?
Yeah, there are downsides to everything. If you're looking to have a lot of discretion in the moment, if you're looking for a lot of flexibility because you want to be able to do something different, or you don't know what you want, then that's why you have a site-by-site negotiation process for some things. And for some people that's really important. The downside of that, of course, is that you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. But the form-based code does presume that we've worked to develop a fairly good understanding of collectively what we want in this place, and we're pretty much planning to to stick to it. You can make modifications, but you don't want to negotiate on a site-by-site basis with all these things, and you can run into situations where you haven't anticipated something. There's a fairly big one that we don't have time to talk about in detail, but that I've in a way slipped in here, which is that one of these, one of the biggest projects I showed, the way the code was originally drafted couldn't quite accommodate it, which meant we had to do something special to be able to get it, which meant we were working outside the process of the code. The code governed the actual design, but we didn't anticipate everything as well. And I do think that there's this trade-off between specificity and having flexibility, and that's where you're going to find some some issues with form-based code as opposed to special exception processes or things that leave a lot of discretion on an individual project basis.
Excellent. So you've covered a lot of ground today, Chris. I appreciate that. Is there anything in closing that you'd like communities to think about in regards to form-based code and how they might implement it?
I'd say I think for most places, although there have been some communities that, as I said, have substituted form-based code for their their whole building regulation. Most places, I think it's going to be a matter of having a particular place you're trying to improve, some place you think has potential, but you can see the existing regulations, the existing zoning you have doesn't do it, and that gives you the opportunity to define a small area and try something, to pilot it perhaps, and I think that's what you need to look at. You look at how can we get a few good blocks, because in much of what we're trying to do in economic development, we want to do things all over our communities that are great, but you really need to start somewhere. And form-based code is a tool that might be useful for you in getting something started in a somewhere that has potential, but that isn't happening by itself. And that might be worth looking into.
Excellent. Well, we thank you very much for your time today, Chris. We've been talking with you for quite a while to have this happen today, and we appreciate all of your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This will conclude our webinar, Using Form-Based Codes to Create Vibrant Walkable Communities. A big thank you to Chris for a great presentation, and to all of you who attended. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. You'll be able to find it in our webinar archives. When you exit from today's webinar, you will be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few minutes to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. The Clearinghouse will be presenting other webinars in the near future, so keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and our weekly newsletter for details. Thank you again, and we hope you will join us again next time.